Is that supposed to be a salute or a stretch, Bob? The room went dead silent. A few nervous chuckles floated from the back, but most people just stared, shocked, embarrassed. Bob Turner's hand was still raised halfway to his forehead, mid-salute when the insult landed. He slowly lowered it, eyes locked on the man behind the podium. Greg Hensley, president of the Bramblewood HOA, stood at the front of the clubhouse in his usual khakis and golf shirt, grinning like he'd just told a harmless joke. But there was nothing harmless about it, and his smirk didn't last long, because across the room Bob's daughter, Lena Turner, stood up, calm, straight-backed and ice-cold. "Did you just mock my father for saluting the flag?" Greg tried to wave it off. "Oh, come on. Don't be dramatic. It was a joke. He served 26 years in the Marines," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "He doesn't salute for fun." Someone near the snack table cleared their throat. Another whispered something and quietly got up to leave. Bob didn't say a word. He just turned, walked outside, and lit a cigarette with the same trembling hands he'd used to carry wounded soldiers out of Fallujah. The meeting went on, technically, but nobody heard much after that. The motion to approve new lawn height restrictions passed. So did the discussion about changing mailbox colors. But the room had shifted, the air was tight, and Lena never sat back down. She just stood in the back, arms crossed, watching Greg shrink in his own chair. Later that night, Bob sat on the back porch of Lena's house, a blanket over his knees and a beer in his hand. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "I shouldn't have raised my hand," he said quietly. "It was instinct." Lena leaned against the railing. "Dad, you don't need to explain anything to that clown." He looked at her with a small, tired smile. "He's the president. He's a property manager with a clipboard. Let's not elevate the man." They sat in silence for a moment, crickets humming in the darkness. "You gonna say something?" he asked eventually. "Oh, I'm gonna do more than say something." Lena didn't yell at the meeting. She didn't post about it online. She didn't send a neighborhood email or write a passive-aggressive letter. What she did was far worse for Greg. She got quiet, and she started writing names down. The next morning, Lena walked into her office downtown and pulled open her Rolodex, not metaphorical, not digital, but an actual Rolodex. Lena worked in city development. She didn't flaunt it, didn't name drop, but she knew who ran which council, who signed off on zoning grants, who had dinner with whom, and more importantly, she knew how Greg got elected HOA president through unchallenged votes, low attendance, and a half-baked campaign where he ran uncontested because no one else wanted the job. But that wasn't all she knew, because Greg hadn't just mocked her father. He'd done it in a room where Bob Turner had saluted the flag every meeting for the past 5 years, without complaint, without fail. And the mayor of Ridgefield, he used to be Bob's commanding officer. Lena didn't call him yet. She didn't need to. First, she had some digging to do, because if Greg wanted to treat veterans like props, if he wanted to turn neighborhood leadership into a personality contest, then she was going to make sure the entire community saw exactly who they'd put in charge. Lena didn't call the mayor right away. She knew better than to lead with emotion, even if the moment still echoed in her ears like it had just happened. Her dad, halfway into a quiet salute, and that smug little laugh from Greg in front of the entire room. No, this wasn't going to be a social media tantrum or a Facebook war. Lena Turner played long games, and she always started by doing her homework. She spent the next day reviewing Bramblewood's HOA bylaws, printed them out, highlighted every section tied to leadership protocol, community ethics, and conduct violations. It didn't surprise her that respectful communication was technically listed under a vague code of ethics, one that Greg had signed, and clearly never read again. She flagged it, then cross-checked Greg's appointment history. He hadn't just been elected once. He'd been reappointed by default, twice, because no one had run against him. The guy treated his HOA seat like a throne, because no one had ever made him answer for it. That was going to change. Lena also reached out to one of her contacts at City Hall, Tanya Ramirez, a community engagement coordinator, who'd worked with Lena on a zoning conflict 2 years earlier. They weren't close friends, but they trusted each other. Lena didn't give the full story. Not yet. She just asked if Tanya had any records of Greg Hensley applying for municipal permits, contracts, or neighborhood partnership programs under Bramblewood's name. Tanya promised to check. If he filed anything sketchy, it'll be in the system. I'll run it quietly. Lena thanked her and moved on. Next, she started talking to her neighbors. Not accusing, not complaining, just asking questions. Hey, did you see Greg's comments at the meeting? How long has he been running the show solo? Do you know how many people have actually voted in the last 2 elections? Most people answered with a mix of awkward laughter and frustrated sighs. It's like he's always been there. One woman said. He acts like he owns the neighborhood. Another said. I stopped going after the time he told me my front planter was too festive. Nobody seemed surprised by what Greg had done to Bob. They were just disappointed and tired. But what they didn't know, what Lena did, was that there was already a city-backed initiative to encourage new leadership in stagnant HOAs. The city had launched it the year before. Few people paid attention, but Lena had worked on it, drafted it, actually, and now, she had every form, every contact, and every eligibility clause memorized. She knew the path to dissolving a standing board seat. She knew what percentage of homeowner signatures were required to force a public recall vote. She knew how to file the paperwork with the city clerk, and how to keep it airtight so it couldn't be challenged on a technicality. But she wasn't ready to strike yet, because there was one more move to make, and it came in the form of a simple phone call. That night, she dialed a number she hadn't used in over a year. Mayor Dan Holloway answered on the second ring. Turner, he said warmly. Haven't heard your voice in a while. I've got a situation, sir, she said, and it involves my dad. The mayor didn't ask for details right away. He listened. Lena told him everything. The meeting, the insult, the silence that followed, the letter of non-apology the HOA posted the next day about unfortunate miscommunications and humor taken out of context. By the time she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then what's the HOA president's name? Greg Hensley. The same Greg who tried to get his neighborhood flagged as a historic district for that grant money. That's him. I owe your dad, Holloway said, and I've been looking for an excuse to revisit that application anyway. Lena didn't hang up with a plan. She hung up with momentum. She didn't need to yell at Greg. She didn't need to confront him in the street, because what was coming wouldn't be loud. It would be procedural, professional, and permanent. And by the time he realized what was happening, Greg Hensley would be too busy trying to save his reputation to insult anyone again, especially not a Marine. The next HOA meeting wasn't crowded, but it was heavier. There was a tension in the air. Not loud, not hostile, just weighted, like something was about to happen, and everyone felt it before the chairs were even filled. Lena arrived 5 minutes early, same as always. She didn't dress up or bring a speech. She wore jeans, a navy sweater, and a neutral expression that didn't give anything away. Greg Hensley, on the other hand, looked like a man clinging to a podium that no longer belonged to him. Same khakis, same forced smile, but the confidence, gone. The meeting began like usual. Call to order, minutes from last session, a quick note about dog leash compliance. But when Greg moved to skip straight to the landscaping budget proposal, Lena raised her hand. I have a motion to introduce a new business item, she said, calmly, but firmly. Greg hesitated. This wasn't submitted in advance. It's a resident's right to raise new business at open meetings, Lena replied, already holding a copy of the bylaws. Section 2.3, paragraph 4. He didn't argue, he just nodded, reluctantly, and gestured for her to continue. Lena stood and faced the room. At the last meeting, the HOA president made a public remark, directed at my father, mocking him for saluting the flag. Some people shifted, A few looked down, most looked straight at Greg. That remark was unprofessional, inappropriate, and a violation of the code of ethics this board is supposed to uphold. But this isn't just about one comment, it's about the culture we've allowed to fester here. One where leadership isn't earned, it's unchallenged. One where accountability only shows up when someone finally gets angry enough to demand it. She paused. Let that settle. I'm here tonight with a signed petition calling for a formal vote of no confidence in President Greg Hensley, effective immediately. The petition meets quorum requirements and was submitted to the city clerk this afternoon. She handed the envelope to Dana, the board secretary, who opened it slowly, scanning the page with widening eyes. Greg opened his mouth, but Lena held up a second sheet. In addition, the mayor of Ridgefield has issued a formal request to review all HOA partnership applications submitted under this administration, including the rejected historic designation grant from last year, which was flagged for irregularities. That got attention. Murmurs broke out across the room. Greg's face went pale. This is personal, he said, voice suddenly sharp. You're mad because of what I said to your dad. I'm furious about what you said to my dad, Lena said, without flinching. But this is about what you've done to this community. She turned to the crowd. How many people here have been fined for planters, flags, or lawn height without a written warning? How many of you have stopped coming to meetings because you feel like your voice doesn't matter? Hands started going up. One woman near the back spoke. I asked a question about mailbox colors last spring and got told to submit it in writing like I was bothering the board. A man added. He told me my wreath looked commercial and that it needed to come down within 24 hours. Then someone else, quieter, I just stopped decorating. Greg tried to retake the floor, but the shift had already happened. Alina, now acting board treasurer, stood up. I move that we acknowledge the petition and schedule a vote of no confidence per our bylaws. I also recommend the board suspend the president's powers, pending that vote. Dana seconded it. The motion passed, 3-1. Greg voted no. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. After the meeting, Bob waited on the front porch of the community center. He wasn't wearing his Marine cap this time, just a windbreaker and a quiet look of curiosity. You do it? He asked. Lena didn't smile, but her eyes did. The vote's next month, she said. But he's done. Bob nodded once. I was gonna say something that night. Thought about standing up. You didn't need to, Lena said. You've stood up for this country more than enough. It's time someone else did it for you. They walked to the car in silence, not angry, not triumphant, just steady, because what mattered had already been said, and now, it was finally being heard. Greg Hensley didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He didn't throw a tantrum when the board suspended his powers pending the recall vote. Instead, he acted like nothing had changed. He kept showing up to meetings, kept nodding along during discussions, kept sending emails to the community listserv with his usual subject lines, friendly reminders from your HOA president. It didn't matter that his title was now disputed. He kept using it anyway. But when that didn't bring the control back, he reached for something he understood even better than bylaws. Rumors. The first signs were subtle. Lena noticed a couple of neighbors avoiding eye contact during her morning walks. The community Facebook group, which had been quiet for weeks, suddenly had a surge of vague posts about respecting our volunteer and the dangers of cancel culture in small communities. One post stood out. It didn't name her, but the intent was obvious. Too many people these days think they can tear down what others built just because they got their feelings hurt. We used to be a neighborhood, not a courtroom. That post got 13 likes, and a comment thread full of platitudes about unity, civility, and letting things go. Lena didn't reply. She didn't need to, because she had already seen this exact playbook, misdirection wrapped in false concern. The next wave came harder. Several residents received an email from a new address, Bramblewood Watch. 2024@protonmail.com. The message warned about recent attempts to hijack the board and accused a certain city-connected resident of trying to install a friendlier board for personal financial gain. It was full of inaccuracies, speculation, and just enough coded language to sound innocent to someone not paying attention. But Lena was paying attention, and the email had crossed a line. This wasn't just smear by suggestion anymore. It was coordinated misinformation. Greg had gone from mocking a Marine to accusing his daughter of corruption. That evening, Lena printed out the email, along with screenshots from the Facebook group and the metadata from the sender. She clipped it all into a file and added it to her growing folder. Retaliation Phase 2. She didn't respond online. She didn't post in the group or write a public rebuttal. Instead, she made a call to Tanya at City Hall. "Hey," Lena said, "you remember how we flagged Greg's historic district grant application last year? Can you check if his name's attached to any other active filings?" Tanya pulled it up within minutes. Actually, yes, he submitted a beautification subsidy request last month, using his title as HOA president. Looks like he backdated the approval vote. Was there a vote? Doesn't look like it. Lena thanked her, downloaded the form, and flagged it for later. Because Greg wasn't just smearing her anymore. He was putting his name on official documents, as if nothing had changed, and possibly breaking the law in the process. Meanwhile, Greg continued playing his role. He met with a few longtime residents over coffee. He stopped by porches during the early evenings, offering his usual tight smiles and well-rehearsed lines about misunderstandings and people taking things the wrong way. But what he failed to realize was that his act had a ceiling. He hadn't just upset Lena, he had humiliated Bob Turner in front of neighbors who had respected the man for decades. And veterans, they talk, they remember. And when one of them gets disrespected, word spreads. One of Bob's old Marine buddies, a man named Richard Gates, showed up unannounced to the next meeting. He wasn't loud. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood at the microphone during the open floor and read a prepared statement. "I served with Robert Turner in 1989. I watched him pull men out of burning vehicles. I watched him bury brothers, then walk into briefings like nothing had happened. That's what service looks like." Then he looked straight at Greg. "And if you think mocking that kind of man in public is acceptable behavior for someone entrusted with leadership, then you've forgotten what respect means." Nobody applauded. Nobody had to. The silence was enough. Later that week, Lena submitted the finalized file to the city ethics office. Inside were a copy of Greg's recent grant application meeting transcripts, showing no such vote ever took place. A breakdown of Greg's previous claims of HOA authority after suspension, screenshots of the smear campaign, emails, and Facebook posts. A letter co-signed by 20 residents, stating their concerns about Greg's misuse of title and retaliation tactics. She didn't ask them to sign it. They offered. The mayor's office confirmed receipt the next day. And while the city had no legal control over HOA elections, it did have the ability to place a freeze on pending municipal grants and issue a statement of ethics concern to the HOA itself. That letter arrived the day before the recall vote. Typed on city letterhead, stamped, signed, it read, "Due to recent complaints and questionable conduct, we will be temporarily suspending partnership funding and requesting leadership clarification from Bramblewood HOA before resuming communication." Greg tried to call it political. He tried to claim the city was retaliating because of Lena, but the board didn't buy it, and neither did the neighborhood. When the ballots were handed out at the recall vote, more people showed up than anyone expected. Old faces, new families, even a few residents who hadn't attended a meeting in years. They came not just because of what Greg said, they came because of how long he got away with it, and now, they were ready to vote him out.
Greg Hensley lost the recall vote by a landslide. 73 ballots were cast. 64 were marked, remove. Only 6 voted to keep him, and 3 were blank, either by accident or quiet protest. He stood motionless as the final count was read aloud by Dana, the board secretary. His arms remained crossed tightly over his chest, and the muscles in his jaw worked like he was chewing down words he didn't trust himself to say. There was no applause, no cheers. The room didn't erupt like some courtroom drama. Instead, the silence settled over him like a verdict, cold, final, and fully earned. Greg didn't speak after the tally. He didn't stay for closing remarks. He didn't shake hands or thank the board. He walked out of the room with his head up, but his shoulders drawn tight, like he still thought he could hold on to the illusion of control if he just left fast enough. No one followed. The board didn't say his name again, and for the first time in years, the Bramblewood HOA meeting ended without Greg in charge. Elena Ruiz was voted in as interim president the following week. The board voted unanimously. Her first motion was simple: to review every enforcement action issued under Greg's administration for fairness, accuracy, and validity. The second was more symbolic, but no less important: the creation of a resident conduct policy that required all board members to sign a community respect pledge before each new term. It wasn't just paper, it was a line in the sand, and everyone in the room understood why it was being drawn. A week later, Lena received a manila envelope in the mail. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the label was familiar. Inside was a single photo, an old one, from her dad's retirement ceremony. Bob Turner, standing at attention in full dress blues, saluting, jaw firm, shoulders squared. Folded behind it was a note, not an apology, just a sentence: "That moment was never mine to mock." It wasn't signed, but she knew who had written it. She placed the photo in the top drawer of her desk. The note she fed through the shredder. Some words don't deserve to live longer than they should. Bob never asked about the vote. He didn't want play-by-play updates or gossip. But when Lena mentioned casually over breakfast that Greg had stepped down, Bob didn't say anything for a moment. He just stirred his coffee and stared out the kitchen window. "I didn't need him to like me," he said. "I just needed him to remember." Lena nodded. "He will, for the rest of his life." The neighborhood began to shift in small visible ways. A new flagpole went up at the entrance of the community, approved without debate. One of the residents proposed a Veteran Voices speaker night, and Bob was invited to share his story during the first one. He declined politely, but said he'd be happy to attend and listen. Several homes swapped out their neutral porch lights for soft amber bulbs, an unspoken nod to unity. Others returned their small decorative flags and potted plants that had once been flagged for violations under Greg's watch. The community didn't forget what happened. They remembered, and they rebuilt from it. Claire, who managed the neighborhood bulletin board, posted a short piece the following month titled, "What We Choose to Honor." It didn't mention Greg, it didn't mention Lena or Bob either, but it asked one simple question: if leadership is about respect, then who have we been asking to follow us, and why? That piece stayed pinned to the board longer than any announcement or event flyer. Lena never asked for credit. She didn't want a seat on the board or a plaque on the clubhouse wall. She never once used her city connections to push a personal agenda. She simply stayed involved, paid attention, and made sure no one else had to fight that hard to be heard again. She still walked with her father every Thursday evening, same loop, same pace. Sometimes neighbors joined, sometimes they just waved, but they always looked her father in the eye now, and they said his name with something that had been missing for a long time: acknowledgement. The morning after the community flagpole was installed, Bob Turner stood beneath it with his hands behind his back. The sun was just clearing the rooftops, casting long warm light over the manicured lawn in front of the Bramblewood clubhouse. The new pole was nothing fancy, aluminum, 30 feet tall, a solar cap on top, but the flag hanging from it snapped clean in the breeze, bold and bright, and exactly where it belonged. Bob didn't salute it this time. He just looked up and gave a quiet nod. That was enough. Lena stood a few steps behind him, watching her father in the silence. No words needed passing between them. The vote had come and gone, the replacement board was in place, and the neighborhood had started to settle into something that almost felt like community again. The fallout wasn't about who won, it was about what was finally safe to say aloud. People had started speaking up in ways that weren't loud, but carried weight. One woman wrote a letter to the board, thanking them for reminding us that power can be corrected. A man in his 70s left a message on Lena's doorstep that read, "I served too. Thank you for saying something when I didn't." Even those who had stayed quiet during the vote began reappearing at meetings, not to fight, but to contribute. The silence that had once protected Greg's behavior had been replaced by something healthier. Attention. People were paying it again. Lena never brought up the petition again. She didn't talk about the mayor's involvement or the ethics report Greg tried to bury. She never forwarded the letter the city sent, even though it clearly stated that multiple claims in Greg's grant application had been factually inaccurate and administratively invalid. Because none of that mattered anymore. The moment had passed, the damage had been acknowledged, and the community had answered. What remained was what came next. Bob didn't go back to saluting the flag at every meeting, not because he stopped caring, but because he didn't need to prove anything anymore. Everyone knew who he was now, not just a veteran, but a neighbor who had been wronged and respected in equal measure. And for Bob, respect meant more when it wasn't asked for. One Saturday, a few weeks after the vote, the board held a small event called Neighbors Who Serve. It wasn't a formal ceremony, just lemonade, folding chairs, and a sign-up sheet for anyone who wanted to share their story. Bob didn't sign up, but he did attend. He sat in the front row, listened to every person who stood at the mic, and shook hands with each one afterward. Some talked about military service, others spoke about teaching, caregiving, volunteering, or organizing block parties for 20 years straight. It was the first event in a long time that didn't feel like obligation, it felt like belonging. Lena didn't need the credit, she never had. But one evening, as she and her dad walked their usual loop, she noticed something taped to the inside of the community bulletin board. It was a photograph, an older one of Bob at the town Veterans Day parade, standing next to Mayor Holloway, in front of City Hall. Someone had drawn a small note beneath it in black marker. Leadership isn't about power, it's about honor. There was no name, no one claimed it, but it stayed up for weeks, and nobody dared take it down. When Lena asked her dad later if he was glad it was all over, he took a long sip of coffee and answered without looking up, "No one owes me anything, kid. But I'll admit, it's nice to be seen again." That was it. No fanfare, no gloating, just the quiet satisfaction of having stood through the storm and outlasted the thunder.